I never imagined that the worst pain of my life would come from the person I loved most in this world. My name is Sabrina. I'm 60 years old, and I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. Until that night when my own daughter made me understand that some wounds cut deeper than any divorce, any loss, any disappointment life had thrown at me before. For 35 years, I had been a mother first, everything else second. I worked double shifts at the diner to pay for Emma's dance classes, her piano lessons, her college tuition. I wore the same 3 dresses to every school event because her new shoes mattered more than my wardrobe. I celebrated every small victory of hers as if it were my own, because honestly, they were. Her achievements became my identity, her happiness my only measuring stick for success. When Emma graduated with her business degree and landed that job at the marketing firm, I felt like I had finally done something right in my life. When she bought her first apartment in the upscale part of town, I was the one who helped her move, scrubbing floors and hanging curtains while she networked at some important lunch meeting. When she started dating Richard, that lawyer with the expensive car and perfectly pressed shirts, I welcomed him with the same warmth I'd shown every friend she'd ever brought home. But somewhere along the way, as Emma climbed higher in her career and deeper into social circles I couldn't even pronounce the names of, I started to notice small changes. The way she'd quickly change the subject when I mentioned my job at the diner, how she'd schedule our coffee dates for early mornings when none of her friends would be around, the subtle way she'd correct my grammar or suggest I dress a little nicer when we went out together. I told myself it was normal. Success changes people. And maybe she was just learning to navigate a world I'd never had access to. I was proud of her sophistication, her confidence, the way she could walk into any room and command attention, even when it meant I felt smaller and more out of place every time we were together. My 60th birthday was approaching, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Not because I particularly wanted to celebrate getting older, but because Emma had mentioned having a small gathering at her place. "Just a few friends, Mom. Nothing fancy." Those words filled me with such joy because it had been months since she'd included me in anything social. I spent days planning what I would contribute. Emma always rolled her eyes at my homemade desserts, calling them so retro, but I decided to make my famous chocolate chip cookies anyway. The recipe had been my mother's, and her mother's before that. These cookies had comforted Emma through broken hearts, celebrated her report card successes, and been her favorite after-school snack for 17 years. Surely her friends would appreciate something made with love, something with history and meaning. I spent the entire morning of my birthday in my small kitchen, measuring ingredients with the precision of someone who had made these cookies thousands of times. The smell of vanilla and brown sugar filled my apartment, and for a moment, I felt useful again, needed. Like I had something valuable to offer. I arrived at Emma's apartment carrying a beautiful tray of warm cookies, wearing my best dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that I'd bought for her college graduation 3 years ago. Through the window, I could see the soft glow of her living room, hear the gentle murmur of conversation and sophisticated laughter. My heart was full of anticipation. When Emma opened the door, something flickered across her face. Was it embarrassment? Irritation? But she smiled quickly and ushered me in. "Mom, you made it, and you brought—" She glanced at the tray in my hands. "Cookies." The apartment was filled with people I didn't recognize. Beautiful people in expensive clothes, holding wine glasses that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The women had perfect hair and designer purses. The men wore watches that gleamed under the soft lighting. They looked like they belonged in magazines. In worlds where homemade anything was probably seen as quaint at best, pathetic at worst. I stood there in my flower dress, holding my grandmother's recipe on a mismatched platter, suddenly feeling like an intruder in my own daughter's life. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment letting us know what city you're watching from. The evening started innocently enough. I tried to blend in, asking polite questions about careers I didn't understand, laughing at jokes whose punchlines went over my head. A few people were kind, complimenting the cookies with the sort of polite enthusiasm reserved for children's artwork. But mostly, I felt invisible, standing in corners while conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. Then came the moment that would replay in my mind for months afterward. The moment when my daughter, my baby girl, the child I had sacrificed everything for, turned me into her entertainment. I should have seen the signs earlier. The way Emma's friends looked at me wasn't just polite disinterest. It was something colder, more calculated. They were studying me like an exhibit in a museum, something curious and outdated that didn't quite belong in their carefully curated world. "So you're Emma's mother," said a woman with platinum blonde hair and diamonds that caught the light every time she moved her hands. "How sweet that you came." The pause before sweet was deliberate, loaded with meaning I was only beginning to understand. I smiled warmly, still believing this was just social awkwardness. "Yes, I'm Sabrina. Emma's told me so much about all of you." That was a lie. Emma rarely talked about her friends anymore, and when she did, it was in vague terms that kept me at a comfortable distance from her real life. "Has she?" The blonde woman exchanged a glance with her companion, a brunette in what looked like a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. "That's interesting." I felt my smile falter slightly, but I pressed on. "I brought some homemade cookies. They're Emma's favorite. Well, they used to be. I thought everyone might enjoy them." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that screams louder than any insult, the kind that tells you exactly how out of place you are without anyone having to say a word. "Homemade," the brunette repeated, as if I'd said something in a foreign language. "How authentic." I began to understand that authentic wasn't meant as a compliment. Emma appeared at my elbow suddenly, her laugh a little too bright, her grip on my arm a little too tight. "Mom, let me introduce you to Richard's colleagues from the firm." She was steering me away from the women, but I could hear their muffled laughter behind us. Richard's colleagues were polite but distant, the kind of politeness that maintains exactly the right amount of space between you and them. They asked about my work with the careful precision of people who already knew they wouldn't find anything impressive in my answers. "I work at Morrison's Diner downtown," I said, trying to inject pride into my voice. "I've been there for 15 years. I know it's not glamorous, but I love taking care of people, making sure they have a good meal and feel welcome." "How noble," one of the lawyers said. His tone suggesting nobility was the last thing he associated with serving coffee and scrambled eggs to truckers and construction workers. Emma's face was flushed, and I realized with growing horror that she was embarrassed. Not embarrassed for me, embarrassed of me. The distinction cut through my chest like a blade. "Actually," Emma said, her voice taking on that bright, deflective tone I'd heard her use in business meetings, "Mom's being modest. She's considering retirement soon. Aren't you, Mom?" I wasn't considering retirement. I couldn't afford retirement. But I nodded anyway, because the alternative was watching my daughter's mortification grow deeper with every truthful word I might speak. The evening continued like this, me being passed from group to group like an obligation, each conversation a careful dance around the obvious fact that I didn't belong. People were kind enough, but it was the kind of kindness you show to someone's elderly relative who doesn't quite understand modern life. I retreated to the kitchen at one point, hoping to find something useful to do, some way to contribute that wouldn't result in those barely concealed smirks and meaningful glances. I found Emma there, pouring wine with the sort of aggressive precision that suggested she was upset. "Mom," she said without looking at me, "maybe you could, I don't know, mingle less? Just for tonight?" The words hit me like cold water. "Mingle less? It's just—" She turned to face me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Resentment. "This is important for Richard's career. These people, they matter. And when you talk about the diner or mention that you take the bus everywhere or—" She gestured vaguely at my dress. "It just doesn't fit the image we're trying to project. We, not I. We. As if my existence was somehow part of her professional strategy. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For being working class? For not being born into the kind of family that could afford to give their children the connections and polish that apparently mattered so much in Emma's world? Just try to blend in, okay? Maybe don't mention work at all. Tell people you're retired or that you do volunteer work or something. As if my 15 years of hard work of getting up at 4 in the morning to prep for the breakfast rush, of learning every regular customer's order by heart, of being the friendly face that made people feel less alone, as if all of that was something to be ashamed of. I went back to the party and tried to follow Emma's advice. When people asked about my work, I smiled vaguely and changed the subject. When they complimented the cookies, I downplayed the effort, as if caring enough to bake from scratch was somehow embarrassing. But the more I tried to diminish myself, the more invisible I became. Not invisible in the way I'd felt when I first arrived, invisible in the way that furniture becomes invisible, present but irrelevant, taking up space without adding value. I watched Emma work the room with skills I'd never taught her, skills she'd learned in the years since she'd grown beyond needing me for anything important. She was charming and sophisticated, perfectly at ease in conversations about markets and investments and vacation destinations I'd never heard of. She was everything I'd wanted her to become: successful, confident, admired. So why did I feel like her success required my disappearance? The worst part wasn't the strangers who looked through me as if I were transparent. The worst part was watching my daughter do the same thing, seeing her avoid eye contact, hearing her laugh a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, as if volume could drown out the awkwardness of having brought her working-class mother into her carefully constructed upper-class world. I found myself thinking about all the sacrifices I'd made to give her opportunities I'd never had. The night shifts I'd worked so she could attend the expensive summer camp. The times I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so she could have new school clothes. The dreams I'd deferred, the relationships I'd sacrificed, the version of myself I'd set aside so she could become everything I'd never been able to be. Had all of that been a mistake? Had I created someone who saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a foundation to build upon? As the evening wore on, I found myself doing something I'd never done before in my daughter's presence. I started to disappear into myself, not physically but emotionally, the way you learn to do when staying visible becomes too painful to bear. I positioned myself near the bookshelf in Emma's living room, trying to look interested in the pristine volumes that were clearly more for decoration than reading. From there, I could observe without participating, watch without the risk of saying something that would further embarrass my daughter. That's when I overheard the conversation that made my blood turn to ice water. "Emma's doing so well for herself," the platinum blonde was saying to a small group near the wine table. "I mean, considering her background." "What do you mean?" asked someone I couldn't see. "Well, look at her mother. Sweet woman, I'm sure, but..." There was that pause again, loaded with judgment. "You can see where Emma came from. Makes her success even more impressive, really. She's completely reinvented herself, as if the person I'd raised, loved, and sacrificed for was just a rough draft that needed to be completely rewritten to be acceptable. It's inspiring, honestly," another voice chimed in, "to think she started with so little and managed to create this life for herself. Though I have to say, bringing her mother tonight was brave. They were talking about my presence at my own daughter's party as an act of courage on Emma's part. I pressed myself deeper into the corner, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it. But they weren't done. "I give her credit for not forgetting where she came from," the first woman continued. "But at some point, you have to know when to evolve beyond your origins, don't you think? Evolve beyond your origins. Evolve beyond me." I looked across the room and found Emma deep in conversation with Richard and his business partner. She was animated, gesturing with her wine glass, completely at home in a way I'd never seen her before. This was her real life. These were her real people. I was just a relic from a past she'd outgrown. A waiter, yes, Emma had hired actual waiters for her small gathering, approached me with a tray of champagne. I took a glass gratefully, hoping the alcohol might numb the sharp edges of what I was hearing and feeling. "Are you enjoying the party?" he asked kindly. He was probably around my age, with gentle eyes and the sort of practiced courtesy that came from years of service work. "It's lovely," I managed, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "That's your daughter, isn't it?" He nodded toward Emma. "The hostess?" "Yes," I said, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old pride. "Yes, that's my Emma. She's very accomplished. You must be proud." "I am," I whispered, And I meant it. Despite everything, despite the growing chasm between us, despite the way she was treating me like an embarrassing secret, I was still proud of her. But pride and heartbreak, I was learning, could coexist in the same heart, creating a pain that was almost unbearable in its complexity. The waiter moved on, and I was alone again with my champagne and my racing thoughts. I tried to focus on the positive. Emma was successful. She was happy. She'd built a life beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. Wasn't that what every mother wanted? But watching her now, seeing how effortlessly she fit into this world that excluded me, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, I'd lost not just my daughter's respect, but her love. Or maybe I'd never really had it the way I thought I did. Maybe I'd been so focused on giving her everything I never had that I'd never noticed she was growing to see me as everything she didn't want to be. A burst of laughter from across the room drew my attention. Emma was in the center of a group now, clearly telling some kind of story that had everyone captivated. Her face was bright with animation, her hands moving expressively, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to regale me with elaborate tales about her day at school. But then I heard fragments of what she was saying, and my world tilted sideways. So there I was, trying to explain to my mother why she couldn't wear her church dress to the company Christmas party. More laughter. And she looks at me with complete sincerity and says, "But Emma, this dress has served me well for 15 years. The group erupted in delighted laughter, the kind that comes from shared superiority, from the comfort of knowing you're on the right side of the joke. My church dress, the navy blue one with flowers that I was wearing right now, the one I'd bought for her graduation, the one I'd saved for months to afford, the one I wore to every important occasion because it was the nicest thing I owned. She was making fun of me, to her friends, at my birthday party. The best part," Emma continued, clearly enjoying her audience, "is that she genuinely thought she was being helpful. She offered to bring homemade cookies to impress my colleagues. Homemade, as if we were having a bake sale instead of a networking event. My cookies. The ones sitting on her kitchen counter right now, the ones that had taken me hours to make, the ones that carried 3 generations of family tradition. She was mocking them, mocking me. I felt something crack inside my chest, not cleanly like breaking glass, but messily, like something vital tearing under too much pressure. Don't get me wrong," Emma added, and I could hear the performative affection in her voice. "I love my mother dearly, but sometimes you have to accept that the people who raised you just don't understand the world you've grown into. The people who raised you, not my mother, not the woman who sacrificed everything for my success. The people who raised you, as if I were some abstract concept rather than the person standing 20 feet away, wearing the dress she was mocking, having made the cookies she was ridiculing." I set my champagne glass down on the nearest surface, my hands trembling so badly I was afraid I'd drop it. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to get away from the sound of my daughter turning my love into entertainment for people who already looked down on everything I represented. I made my way toward the bathroom, hoping to collect myself, to find some way to process what I'd just heard. But as I passed another group, I caught more fragments of conversation that stopped me in my tracks. "Really admire Emma for how she's handled her family situation. Takes real strength to rise above that kind of background. Though, honestly, I'm not sure I could handle having my mother here tonight. Emma's got more patience than I would." Patience. They were talking about my presence at my own daughter's birthday party as something Emma was patiently enduring. I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in Emma's expensive mirror. The woman looking back at me was exactly who I'd always been, a working mother who'd done her best with what she had. But tonight, for the first time, I was seeing myself through Emma's eyes, through her friend's eyes. I saw the dress that was 15 years old but still my nicest, the hands that showed the signs of decades of service work, the face that bore lines from years of worry about bills and Emma's future, the hair that I cut myself because salon visits weren't in my budget. I saw everything they saw when they looked at me. Not a loving mother, not a hardworking woman, not someone worthy of respect. I saw someone to be evolved beyond, someone to be patiently endured, someone whose homemade cookies and church dresses were quaint embarrassments in a world that valued appearance over substance. For 60 years, I'd never felt ashamed of who I was. Tonight, my own daughter had taught me what shame felt like. I stayed in that bathroom longer than I should have, staring at my reflection and trying to find some version of myself that made sense anymore. The woman in the mirror looked exactly the same as she had that morning when she'd been so excited about her daughter's party. But everything else had fundamentally changed. When I finally emerged, the party was in full swing. People were laughing, drinking, networking, doing all the things successful people do at successful gatherings. And there I was, moving through it all like a ghost, invisible except when my presence became an inconvenience. I found myself gravitating toward the kitchen again, drawn by some instinct that told me this was where I belonged. Not among the guests, but in the service areas. The behind-the-scenes spaces where the real work happened while others enjoyed the results. My cookies sat on the counter, largely untouched except for a few polite bites. Next to them was an elaborate dessert display that must have cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Perfect petit fours, chocolate-dipped strawberries, macarons in delicate pastel colors. Everything looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, professionally crafted and aesthetically flawless. My grandmother's chocolate chip cookies looked suddenly homely and amateurish by comparison. Brown and simple and obviously homemade, they represented everything Emma was trying to distance herself from. The humble, the handcrafted, the made with love rather than money. I picked up one of my own cookies and took a bite. It tasted exactly like childhood, like after-school comfort, like the kitchen where Emma used to sit doing homework while I cooked dinner. But that kitchen, that child, that version of our relationship, they might as well have existed in another lifetime. "There you are, Mom." Emma's voice made me jump. She appeared in the doorway, her smile bright and practiced. "I was wondering where you'd gone." "Just helping in the kitchen," I said automatically, though there was nothing for me to help with. Emma's eyes flicked to the untouched cookies, and something uncomfortable passed across her face. "Listen, Mom, I think maybe you should head home soon. You look tired." Tired. That was her excuse for wanting me gone from my own birthday party. "It's only 9 o'clock, I said quietly. "I know, but you have to work tomorrow, right? And this crowd? They'll probably be here until midnight. I just don't want you to feel obligated to stay." Obligated. As if my presence was a duty I was performing rather than a celebration I was attending. "Of course," I heard myself say. I'll just say goodbye to a few people." "Actually," Emma said quickly, "why don't I walk you to your car? These people can be overwhelming. I'll handle the goodbyes." She didn't want me saying goodbye to her friends. She didn't want to risk me embarrassing her one more time with my working-class mannerisms or my homemade sentiments. I gathered my purse and the empty tray that had held my rejected cookies, and followed my daughter through her apartment like a visitor being politely but firmly escorted out. In the elevator down to the parking garage, Emma made small talk about the weather, about her work, about anything except what had just happened upstairs. I responded with the appropriate murmurs, but my mind was reeling. This was my birthday party. I was being dismissed from my own birthday party by my own daughter because my presence was an inconvenience to her social climbing. "Thanks for coming, Mom," Emma said when we reached my 15-year-old Honda, the car that looked so shabby next to the BMWs and Mercedes in the garage. "I hope you had a good time." Had a good time. At the party where I'd been treated like hired help, where I'd heard my daughter mock everything about me to strangers, where I'd learned that my love and sacrifice had somehow transformed into embarrassment and resentment. "It was lovely, honey," I lied, because what else do you say when your heart is breaking and your daughter is clearly anxious to get back to her real celebration, the one that would begin in earnest once the source of her embarrassment was safely removed? Emma hugged me briefly, the kind of perfunctory embrace you give someone you're obligated to be affectionate with but don't particularly want to touch. Then she was gone, clicking back across the concrete in her expensive heels, leaving me alone with my car and my confusion, and my growing understanding that everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my daughter had been a comfortable delusion. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened. Through Emma's windows 20 floors above, I could see the warm glow of the party continuing without me. The real party, the one where my absence would be a relief rather than a loss. The drive home took me through neighborhoods I couldn't afford to live in, past restaurants I couldn't afford to eat in, through a city that seemed to have been designed for people with Emma's resources rather than people with mine. Every red light gave me another moment to replay the evening, to catalog each small cruelty, each moment of exclusion, each indication that I had somehow become the villain in my own daughter's success story. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I walked in, shabbier. More obviously, the home of someone who'd been left behind by progress and prosperity. The furniture I'd been proud of, bought piece by piece over years of careful saving, suddenly looked tired and outdated. The photographs of Emma that covered my refrigerator and end tables seemed to mock me, evidence of a love that was apparently more burden than blessing. I set the empty cookie tray on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. 3 generations of women had used this recipe to show love, to create comfort, to mark special occasions. My grandmother had made these cookies during the Depression, somehow finding sugar and chocolate when money was scarce because she understood that sweetness was a kind of hope, a promise that better times were possible. My mother had made them for my birthdays, for school events, for every moment when life felt too hard and a child needed to know she was cherished. I had made them for Emma throughout her childhood, teaching her to crack eggs and measure flour, passing down not just a recipe but a tradition of nurturing, of creating something beautiful and nourishing with your own hands. And tonight, that tradition had become a punchline, a symbol of everything my daughter wanted to move beyond. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Emma had done her homework, where we'd planned her future, where I'd balanced checkbooks and made lists and dreamed of all the ways I could help her succeed. And for the first time since her father left when she was 7, I felt completely and utterly alone. Not just alone in my apartment, but alone in the world. The person I'd built my entire adult life around, the relationship that had given meaning to every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred. It had all been revealed as something entirely different than I'd imagined. I wasn't Emma's beloved mother. I was her embarrassing origin story, something to be managed and minimized and eventually, perhaps, left behind entirely. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, though that burned like acid in my chest. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, though hearing my daughter mock me to strangers had felt like a physical assault. The worst part was the dawning realization that this hadn't been a sudden change, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by social pressure. This had been building for years. Every canceled lunch, every shortened phone call, every time she'd seemed distracted when I talked about my life, it had all been part of a gradual process of distancing herself from someone she saw as an impediment to her advancement. I had raised her to be successful, and her success required my diminishment. I sat in my quiet kitchen until well past midnight, long after Emma's party had probably ended, long after her guests had gone home to lives I would never understand. And somewhere in those dark hours, something inside me that had always believed in the power of love, in the strength of family bonds, in the idea that sacrifice and devotion would ultimately be rewarded, that something quietly died. But as I finally prepared for bed, putting away the empty cookie tray and turning off the lights, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something different in my eyes. Not the defeated woman who'd been dismissed from her own birthday party. Something else. Something that whispered, maybe it's time to stop disappearing and start becoming someone who can't be ignored. But I still had something they had forgotten, something they had never bothered to really see. The morning after my birthday party, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't face the routine of serving coffee and scrambled eggs to strangers when I felt like my entire sense of self had been scrambled beyond recognition. I spent the day doing something I rarely allowed myself. I sat still. No cleaning, no meal prep for the week ahead, no errands or obligations. Just me, in my small living room, surrounded by the silence I'd been too busy to notice for years. That's when I started to really think about who I was beyond being Emma's mother. When was the last time I'd done something just for myself? When was the last time I'd pursued an interest that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's dreams? When was the last time I'd allowed myself to want something that didn't revolve around making life better for other people, I couldn't remember. For 35 years, my identity had been so wrapped up in motherhood that I'd forgotten I was a complete person with my own gifts, my own value, my own right to take up space in the world. I'd been so focused on making myself smaller, so Emma could be bigger, that I'd nearly disappeared entirely. But sitting there in my quiet apartment, I began to remember fragments of who I'd been before I became defined entirely by what I could do for others. In high school, I'd loved to write. Nothing fancy, just stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength in difficult circumstances. My English teacher had told me I had a gift for capturing the human heart in simple, honest language. I'd dreamed briefly of journalism school, of maybe working for a local newspaper, of using words to help people feel less alone. But then I'd gotten pregnant with Emma at 22, and writing became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every spare moment went to earning money, to childcare, to building the stable life I wanted my daughter to have. The stories stayed locked in my head, never making it to paper because paper was for grocery lists and homework help, not dreams. I'd also loved to cook, not just the practical cooking that kept us fed, but the creative kind that turned simple ingredients into something magical. Before Emma outgrew her need for after-school snacks and family dinners, I used to experiment with recipes, combining flavors in ways that surprised even me. Neighbors would smell whatever I was making and knock on the door, drawn by aromas that promised comfort and care. But somewhere along the way, as Emma grew more sophisticated and my cooking became more embarrassing, I'd stopped experimenting. I'd stopped creating. I'd started apologizing for homemade anything, as if love expressed through food was somehow primitive and shameful. What else had I given up? What other parts of myself had I systematically dismantled in the service of being the perfect supporting character in someone else's life? That afternoon, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I went to the library. Not to research something for Emma, not to use the free computer for job applications, but just because I wanted to be surrounded by books, by stories, by the accumulated wisdom of people who'd found ways to transform their pain into something meaningful. I wandered through the stacks, pulling books almost at random, reading first paragraphs and dedication pages, remembering what it felt like to read for pleasure rather than purpose. In the memoir section, I found a book by a woman who'd started a successful catering business at 65, after her husband left her for someone younger. Another about a grandmother who'd become a community activist after losing her grandson to violence. Story after story of women who'd discovered their true power only after they'd lost everything they thought defined them. I checked out 5 books and spent the evening reading in a way I hadn't since Emma was small, completely absorbed, taking notes in margins, feeling my mind stretch and expand after years of contraction. The next day, I went back to work, but something had shifted. I found myself really listening to the customers at the diner, not just taking their orders, but hearing their stories. Mrs. Chen, who came in every Tuesday, was struggling with loneliness after her children moved across the country. Mr. Rodriguez was working 3 jobs to put his daughter through college. Sarah, the young mother who came in with her toddler, was trying to finish her nursing degree while supporting her family. All these people, carrying their own versions of sacrifice and hope and disappointment, and I'd been serving them for 15 years without truly seeing them. During my break, I started writing. Nothing elaborate, just observations about the people I served, the stories they carried, the small moments of grace that happened between strangers over coffee and pie. I wrote on napkins, on the backs of order slips, on whatever paper I could find. The words came easily, as if they'd been waiting all these years for permission to exist. The woman at table 6 orders her eggs over easy every Tuesday at 10:30, I wrote. Not because she's hungry, but because this is the 1 hour in her week when someone asks how she'd like something and actually waits for her answer. The construction worker who comes in during the breakfast rush never looks up from his phone while he eats. But he always says, "Thank you, sweetheart," when I refill his coffee. And his voice carries the weight of someone who remembers when good manners mattered more than efficiency. Small observations, simple truths, but they felt more authentically mine than anything I'd created in years. On Friday afternoon, when my shift ended, instead of going straight home to clean and meal prep and organize my life around other people's needs, I stopped at a community bulletin board outside the grocery store. I'd passed it thousands of times without really seeing it. But today, something made me pause and actually read what was posted there. Community Center seeks volunteers, read one flyer. Help with literacy programs, senior meals, and community outreach. All skills and experience levels welcome. Make a difference in your neighborhood. Below that, Writer's Workshop, first Monday of every month. Share your stories, develop your craft, connect with other local writers, beginners encouraged. And at the bottom of the board, almost hidden behind larger announcements, cooking classes for seniors, volunteer instructors needed. Share your favorite recipes and cooking techniques with community members who want to learn. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't pain or shame or confusion. I felt possibility. What if my years of feeding people, of knowing how to stretch $1 into a satisfying meal, of understanding that food was love made tangible, what if all of that wasn't something to be embarrassed about? What if it was actually valuable? What if the stories I'd been collecting about ordinary people living extraordinary lives were worth telling? What if my experience of sacrifice and service and resilience was exactly what other people needed to hear? I stood in front of that bulletin board for 20 minutes, reading and rereading those notices, feeling something wake up inside me that had been sleeping for years. It wasn't anger, not yet. It wasn't revenge or bitterness, or the desire to prove Emma wrong about me. It was something much more dangerous than that. It was the quiet recognition that I had value that existed entirely independent of what I could do for other people, that my worth wasn't determined by whether my daughter was proud of me or embarrassed by me. That maybe, just maybe, I had gifts the world needed, even if Emma couldn't see them. For the first time since that devastating birthday party, I smiled. Not the practiced smile I wore for customers or the nervous smile I'd worn at Emma's gathering. A real smile, born from the growing understanding that my story wasn't over. It was just beginning. I took out my phone and dialed the number on the community center flyer. When someone answered, I heard myself say words I hadn't spoken in decades. Hi, I'm calling about volunteering. I have some skills I think might be useful, and I'm ready to share them. It wasn't about proving anything to Emma or her friends. It wasn't about getting revenge or making a point. It was about remembering who I was beyond their narrow definition of me. And once I remembered that, everything else would follow. The Lincoln Community Center sat in a part of town I'd driven through but never really seen. A neighborhood where working families lived in small houses with carefully tended gardens, where children played on sidewalks and elderly people sat on porches watching the world go by with the unhurried attention of those who'd learned to find contentment in simple observations. My first day as a volunteer, I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since Emma's first day of school. But it was a different kind of nervous. Not the anxiety of someone afraid to fail, but the anticipation of someone about to discover what she was truly capable of. Margaret Torres, the center's director, was a woman in her 70s with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. When I explained my background, 15 years at the diner, a lifetime of cooking on tight budgets, some writing that I wasn't sure counted as real experience, she smiled in a way that made me feel like I'd just told her exactly what she'd been hoping to hear. Honey, she said, half our community are people just like you, folks who know how to make something beautiful out of very little, who understand that the most important ingredients in any recipe are time and care. The other half are folks who never learned those skills because they never had to, and now they're trying to figure out how to live on fixed incomes or take care of aging parents or feed families when everything costs more than it used to. She walked me through the center's main room, where seniors were gathered around tables playing dominoes and sharing coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since morning. What we need is someone who can teach people that cooking isn't about having the fanciest ingredients or the most expensive equipment. It's about understanding that feeding people is an act of love, and love always finds a way. My first cooking class was supposed to be about budget-friendly meals, but it became something much more than that. 12 people showed up, mostly women my age or older, some with their adult children, all looking slightly skeptical that someone who worked at a diner could teach them anything they didn't already know. I started with something simple, my grandmother's chicken soup, the one that could stretch one chicken into 3 days' worth of meals. the one that had carried our family through every illness and heartbreak and financial crisis for 3 generations. But as I demonstrated how to brown the bones for deeper flavor, how to use potato peels and onion skins and celery leaves that most people threw away, how to turn scraps into liquid gold, something magical happened in that room. People started sharing their own stories. Mrs. Patterson talked about learning to cook during World War II, when everything was rationed and creativity was survival. Miguel shared how his grandmother in El Salvador could make a feast out of ingredients most Americans wouldn't even recognize. Betty told us about feeding 6 children on her husband's factory wages, how she'd learned that love was the secret ingredient that made every meal taste like abundance, even when money was scarce. I found myself facilitating conversations that went far beyond recipes. These were stories about resilience, about the wisdom that comes from making do, about the profound dignity of people who'd learned to create beauty and nourishment under circumstances that would have broken others. After that first class, Margaret pulled me aside. "I've been running programs here for 20 years, she said, "and I've never seen people open up like that. You have a gift, Sabrina, not just for cooking, but for making people feel seen. Making people feel seen." The phrase stayed with me as I walked to my car. As I drove home through neighborhoods I was beginning to see with different eyes. When was the last time anyone had told me I had a gift? When was the last time I'd been valued for something other than my ability to serve others quietly and efficiently? The writing workshop was a different kind of revelation. The first Monday I showed up, I almost turned around and left 3 times. The other participants looked so literary, so intellectual, carrying leather notebooks and discussing books I'd never heard of with the casual authority of people who'd never doubted their right to have opinions about art and literature. But the workshop leader, a retired English professor named David, had the same quality Margaret possessed: the ability to make everyone feel like their story mattered, regardless of their education or experience. "Everyone in this room has lived a life worth documenting," he said that first night. "The question isn't whether your experiences are significant enough to write about. The question is whether you're brave enough to tell the truth about what you've seen." I started reading the pieces I'd been writing on napkins during my breaks at the diner. Simple observations about customers, small moments of human connection, the quiet heroism of people trying to make decent lives under difficult circumstances. The room was silent when I finished reading a piece about Mrs. Chen, the lonely widow who came in every Tuesday, not because she needed the food, but because she needed someone to see her, to acknowledge her existence, to treat her like she still mattered. "That's beautiful," said one of the other writers, a woman who'd been working on what sounded like a very sophisticated novel about art dealers in New York. "You have this way of finding the sacred in the ordinary that's really remarkable." The sacred in the ordinary. I thought about that phrase all week. Began to see my work at the diner differently, began to understand that serving people food was just the surface of what I'd been doing for 15 years. I'd been witnessing lives, holding space for stories, providing comfort and dignity and human connection to people who might not get it anywhere else. Over the following weeks, something began to build inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet confidence I'd never possessed before. At the community center, I was becoming known as someone who could teach more than recipes. People started seeking me out for advice about everything from stretching grocery budgets to dealing with difficult family situations to finding meaning when life felt overwhelming. "You should write a cookbook," Margaret suggested one afternoon as we cleaned up after a particularly successful class. But not just recipes, stories. The stories behind the food, the history of how these dishes carried families through hard times. A cookbook. The idea felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. I'd been collecting recipes my entire adult life, but more than that, I'd been collecting the stories that went with them, the memories and traditions and small moments of grace that happened when people gathered around tables to share food and time and attention. That night, I started writing in earnest for the first time since high school. Not just observations and character sketches, but a real project with purpose and structure. I wrote about my grandmother's Depression-era creativity, my mother's Sunday dinners that turned our tiny kitchen into a place where neighbors felt welcome, my own years of learning that the most expensive ingredient in any recipe was caring enough to do it right. I wrote about Emma's childhood, about the cookies we'd baked together, and the lessons I'd tried to teach her about the difference between feeding people and nourishing them. I wrote about the customers at the diner, the stories they'd shared over coffee refills, the ways that simple food had become the backdrop for some of the most profound human connections I'd ever witnessed. As the weeks passed, word about my classes began to spread beyond the community center. People started bringing friends, then those friends brought their friends. The local newspaper did a small feature about the center's programs and mentioned my cooking classes specifically. Nothing major, just a few paragraphs in the community section, but it was the first time my name had appeared in print since Emma's high school honor roll announcements. I started getting phone calls from people asking if I offered private lessons, if I catered small events, if I would consider teaching at other community centers around the city. The idea that my skills, my humble, working-class, embarrassing skills, were actually in demand was still foreign to me, but undeniable. 3 months after that devastating birthday party, I looked in the mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. Not because I'd changed dramatically on the outside, but because something fundamental had shifted in the way I held myself, the way I met my own eyes. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was becoming visible in ways I'd never imagined possible. Emma called occasionally, brief conversations about work and weather that carefully avoided any reference to her party or my abrupt departure. She seemed to assume we'd simply move past what had happened, that I'd accept my role as the embarrassing mother who knew better than to expect inclusion in her real life. But I was no longer the woman who'd left her apartment that night. I was someone who taught cooking classes that changed people's lives, someone whose writing was beginning to find its voice, someone who'd discovered that her years of service and sacrifice had given her wisdom worth sharing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was something far more powerful than that. I was ready. 6 months after my birthday party, I was standing in the kitchen at Lincoln Community Center, preparing for what had become our largest cooking class yet. 45 people had signed up for comfort food, comfortable budget, when Margaret rushed in with news that would change everything. "Sabrina, you need to see this," she said, holding her phone with the kind of excitement that made her hands shake slightly. "Channel 7 is doing a series on unsung heroes in the community, and someone nominated you. They want to feature your classes and interview you for the evening news." Channel 7. The same station Emma watched religiously every morning while getting ready for work. The same evening news she had playing in the background during her networking dinner parties. "I don't understand," I said, though my heart was already beginning to race. "Someone nominated me?" "Mrs. Patterson. She says your cooking classes saved her marriage because her husband finally stopped complaining about her food. And more importantly, saved her confidence because she realized she'd been apologizing her whole life for not being something she was never supposed to be in the first place." Mrs. Patterson, the sweet woman who'd been coming to my classes since the beginning, who'd shared stories about cooking during the war, who'd become one of my most devoted students. "But that's not all," Margaret continued, her smile growing wider. "Remember that cookbook idea we talked about? Well, I may have sent a few of your recipes and stories to my daughter who works in publishing in Chicago, and she may have shown them to an editor who specializes in community cookbooks and memoirs. My cookbook. The project I'd been working on quietly for months, writing late into the evening after my shifts at the diner, collecting not just recipes but the stories that went with them. 3 generations of women learning to create abundance from scarcity, to feed families and communities with whatever they had on hand. "They want to meet with you," Margaret said. "The editor. She's coming to town next week specifically to observe one of your classes and discuss a potential book deal." A book deal. The phrase felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, people who'd gone to college and had connections and belonged to the world Emma inhabited. But even as part of me felt the old familiar imposter syndrome rising up, a stronger part of me, the part that had been growing steadily over these past months, recognized this as simply the natural consequence of work I'd been doing with passion and authenticity. "There's more," Margaret said, though I wasn't sure my heart could handle any more revelations. "The Community Center Board met last night, and they've decided to offer you a full-time position as Director of Community Programming. It would mean leaving the diner, coordinating all our classes and workshops, maybe even expanding to other centers around the city, full-time." A real job with benefits and a title, and the kind of respect I'd never imagined possible for someone with my background. I sank into one of the folding chairs we used for class, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, I'd been the embarrassing mother who brought homemade cookies to a party where they weren't wanted. Now I was being offered opportunities I'd never even dreamed of pursuing. The television interview happened on a Thursday evening. I wore my best dress. Not the navy one with flowers, but a simple black one I'd bought specifically for the occasion. My first purchase for myself, not for anyone else's approval, in more years than I could count. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, was professional but warm. She'd done her research, talking to my students, visiting the community center, even interviewing some of my regular customers at the diner. "What strikes me most about your story," Jessica said as the camera rolled, "is how you've taken skills that some people might consider ordinary, cooking, listening, caring for others, and turned them into something that's genuinely transforming your community. Can you tell us how that happened?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the people who would see this. Emma's colleagues, her sophisticated friends, the people who'd looked through me like I was invisible at that birthday party. "I think we live in a world that's forgotten the value of simple things," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We're taught to believe that if something doesn't require a degree or come with a fancy title, it's not important. But feeding people, really feeding them, their bodies and their spirits, that's one of the most important things any of us can do. Your cookbook comes out next month," Jessica continued. "What do you hope readers will take away from it? That every family has wisdom worth passing down. That the women who came before us survived incredible hardships by learning to create something beautiful out of whatever they had. That there's profound dignity in the simple act of caring for people, even when, especially when, the world tells you that caring isn't sophisticated enough to matter." The segment aired 2 nights later. I watched it alone in my apartment, hardly recognizing the confident, articulate woman on screen. This person spoke with authority about the importance of community, about the wisdom embedded in traditional skills, about the way food could become a bridge between people who might otherwise never understand each other. My phone started ringing within an hour of the broadcast ending. People I hadn't heard from in years, neighbors I barely knew, strangers who'd gotten my number from mutual friends. Everyone wanted to talk about the interview, to tell me they'd had no idea I was doing such important work, to express amazement at the articulate, passionate woman they'd seen on television. But the call I was both hoping for and dreading never came. Emma said nothing. 3 days later, I was setting up for what had become my signature workshop. From scratch, stories and recipes for hard times. When I noticed someone standing in the doorway who made my heart skip several beats. Emma, looking uncomfortable and out of place in her expensive business attire, clearly having second thoughts about whatever had brought her here. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her, and there were lines around her eyes that suggested stress, fatigue, maybe the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to maintain an image that requires constant effort to sustain. "Hi, Mom," she said quietly, as if testing the words. The class was full, 50 people had signed up, and we'd had to move to the larger conference room to accommodate everyone. I could see Emma taking in the crowd, the professional-looking banner Margaret had made for my workshops, the table full of my cookbook pre-orders, the obvious respect and attention with which people treated me. This was not the world she'd expected to find her embarrassing mother inhabiting. "I saw the news story," she said, still standing uncertainly by the door. I didn't realize you'd been doing all this." All this. As if my transformation from invisible diner waitress to respected community leader was a magic trick, rather than the result of months of hard work and the cultivation of gifts I'd been suppressing for decades. "Would you like to stay for the class?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, professional. This was my space now, my expertise, my community. She was welcome as a participant, but not as the authority figure who got to determine my worth. Emma nodded uncertainly and found a seat in the back, trying to blend in among people who clearly belonged here in a way she did not. I began the workshop the same way I always did, with a story about my grandmother's ability to feed 8 people on ingredients that should have barely fed 4, about the Depression-era creativity that turned scraps into sustenance and scarcity into abundance. But as I talked, I found myself really looking at Emma for the first time in months. And what I saw wasn't the confident, sophisticated daughter who'd been embarrassed by my homemade cookies and working-class origins. What I saw was a woman who looked tired, stressed, maybe even lost. Someone who'd built her entire identity around impressing people who didn't actually care about her, who'd sacrificed authentic relationships for the appearance of success, who'd traded the love and support of family for acceptance in circles where acceptance was always conditional and temporary. As the class progressed, I watched Emma struggle with the simple tasks that came naturally to everyone else. Measuring flour, understanding how dough should feel, recognizing the signs that ingredients were ready to become something greater than their individual parts. She was surrounded by people who were older, less educated, certainly less wealthy than she was, but they possessed skills and wisdom and a kind of contentment that she clearly lacked. They knew how to create beauty and nourishment from humble ingredients. They understood that the most important things in life couldn't be purchased or networked into existence. They had something she'd forgotten she ever wanted: the ability to take care of themselves and others in the most fundamental ways. When the class ended and people began to leave, Emma lingered, clearly wanting to talk but not sure what to say. The confidence that had allowed her to mock me in front of her friends seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. "Mom," she said finally, when we were alone in the room except for Margaret, who was tactfully cleaning up at the far end of the space, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." I waited, not making it easier for her, not rushing to forgive before she'd fully acknowledged what had happened between us. "I saw you on the news," she continued, "and I realized I don't actually know who you are anymore. Maybe I never did. I was so focused on becoming someone different from where I came from that I forgot to see who you actually were." She looked around the room, at the evidence of the community I'd built, the respect I'd earned, the life I'd created that had nothing to do with her approval or disapproval. "I think," she said slowly, "I think I've been afraid of the wrong things." I looked at my daughter standing there in my workshop space, surrounded by the evidence of a life she'd never bothered to see, and felt something I hadn't experienced in our relationship for years: genuine compassion for her struggle. But compassion didn't mean I was ready to make this easy. "Afraid of the wrong things," I repeated, my voice gentle but firm. "What do you mean by that?" Emma looked around the room again, taking in the professional banner, the table full of pre-ordered cookbooks, the lingering warmth from a community that had embraced me exactly as I was. I was afraid of being associated with anything that looked ordinary, working class. I thought success meant leaving all of that behind, proving I was different, better than where I came from. She paused, her voice getting smaller. "But I think I left behind the parts of myself that actually mattered. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Not yet." "Emma," I said, settling into one of the folding chairs and gesturing for her to sit across from me. "Do you remember what you said at your party? About my cookies? About me?" She flinched, color rising in her cheeks. "Mom, I was trying to fit in with people who weren't worth fitting in with." "No," I said, not unkindly, but with absolute clarity. "You weren't trying to fit in. You were trying to distance yourself from me by making me the punchline of a joke. You turned my love into entertainment for strangers." The words hung between us, and I watched Emma truly absorb them for the first time. She'd probably replayed that night many times since seeing me on television, but hearing me name what had happened seemed to hit her differently. "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I don't know how to take it back." "You can't," I said simply. "But you can do something different going forward." Over the next hour, Emma told me things I'd never known, about the pressure she felt in her job, where success was measured by how well you could network with people who had inherited what she was desperately trying to earn, about Richard, who'd recently broken up with her for someone whose family had better connections, about the colleagues who'd made it clear that her background was always going to be a liability unless she could completely erase it. "I thought I was protecting my future," she said, "but I think I was just scared. Scared that if people knew the truth about where I came from, they'd see me the way I was afraid I saw myself. And how was that? Not good enough, not sophisticated enough, not worthy of the life I wanted. I reached across the small space between us and took her hand, something I hadn't done since she was a child. "Emma," I said, "do you know what I've learned over these past 6 months?" She shook her head. "That the people who matter don't care where you came from. They care who you are when you show up. And the people who judge you for your background, who require you to erase your history to earn their acceptance, those aren't your people." I told her about Mrs. Patterson, who'd grown up in a mansion but had found more joy in my community center classes than in decades of country club luncheons. About Miguel, who'd built a successful construction business but still treasured the recipes his grandmother had taught him in their tiny apartment. About Margaret, who had a master's degree in social work, but considered my life experience more valuable than any formal education. "These people embrace all of who they are," I explained. "They don't apologize for their origins or try to hide their stories. And because of that, they've built something real, something that can't be taken away by changing fashions or economic downturns, or the opinions of people who were never really friends to begin with." Emma was crying now, quietly but steadily. "I don't know how to be that person," she said. "I don't know how to stop being afraid of not being enough." "You start small," I said, thinking of my own journey from invisible diner waitress to respected community leader. "You stop pretending to be someone you're not. You stop apologizing for the things that actually made you strong. You remember that the woman who raised you taught you values that matter more than any networking connection or social status." "Can you teach me?" she asked, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she sounded like my daughter, instead of a stranger wearing my daughter's face. "I can teach you to cook the way your grandmother did, the way I tried to teach you when you were small. But the rest? Learning to value yourself for who you really are instead of who you think you should be, that's work you'll have to do yourself." The following weeks brought changes I couldn't have imagined. Emma started coming to my Saturday morning workshops, not as my daughter seeking forgiveness, but as a student learning skills she'd dismissed as unimportant. She struggled at first, her hands uncertain with tasks that had once been second nature, her perfectionist tendencies making her frustrated with the messy, imperfect process of learning to create something nourishing from simple ingredients. But gradually, something beautiful began to happen. As Emma learned to knead bread without worrying about whether her technique looked professional, as she discovered the satisfaction of making soup that tasted like home, as she sat around tables with people who valued her questions more than her connections, I watched my daughter begin to remember who she'd been before she'd decided that wasn't good enough. My cookbook, From Scratch, 3 Generations of Making Do, was published 3 months later. The launch event was held at the community center, and the room was packed with people whose stories were woven throughout the book's pages. Local news covered it, food bloggers wrote reviews, and within a week it had made the regional bestseller list. But the moment that mattered most to me came when Emma stood up during the question and answer portion of the evening and said, "I want to tell you all about the woman who wrote this book, because I spent years not seeing what was right in front of me." She talked about growing up with a mother who could make magic happen in the kitchen, who never threw away anything that could be transformed into something beautiful, who taught by example that taking care of people was one of the highest forms of love. "I got so caught up in trying to become someone impressive," she said to the room full of people who already found me impressive exactly as I was, "that I forgot the most impressive thing I'd ever witnessed was my mother's ability to create abundance out of whatever we had, and to do it with such grace that I never felt like we were lacking anything important." She looked directly at me. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see what everyone else could see immediately, that you were already remarkable, exactly as you were." The room erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. I was looking at my daughter, seeing her clearly for the first time in years, and recognizing something I'd given up hope of seeing again: respect. Not just love, which had never really disappeared despite everything, but genuine respect for who I was and what I'd accomplished. 6 months later, Emma left her high-pressure marketing job and opened a small catering business specializing in comfort food for modern families. She uses recipes from my cookbook, employs several of my former students, and runs her business according to principles I spent 35 years trying to teach her: that success means creating something valuable for your community, that authenticity matters more than appearance, and that the best things in life grow slowly, from roots planted deep in soil that others might consider ordinary. We have dinner together every Sunday now, in my small apartment with the mismatched dishes and the table where she once did her homework. She brings flowers, I make something from scratch, and we talk about everything we should have been talking about all along. Books we're reading, dreams we're pursuing, the small daily victories that make life meaningful even when nobody's watching. Last Sunday, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Emma found the old photo album I'd been looking through, pictures of her childhood, of birthday parties with homemade cakes, of Christmas mornings when I'd spent months saving for gifts that probably seemed small compared to what her friends received. "Look at how happy I was," she said, studying a picture of herself at age 8, flower in her hair, helping me make cookies for her school bake sale. I was so proud of those cookies. I remember telling everyone at school that my mom was the best baker in the world. "You were," I said. And I was. She looked up at me, this successful businesswoman who'd learned to value the skills her working-class mother had tried to teach her decades earlier. "I still think that," she said. "I'm just sorry I forgot it for a while." That night, after Emma left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the journey that had brought me here. The devastating birthday party that had shattered everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my daughter. The months of rebuilding myself from the ground up, discovering gifts I'd never known I possessed, learning that my value existed independent of anyone else's approval. The community center job that had introduced me to people who saw wisdom in my experience rather than embarrassment. The cookbook that had turned my grandmother's Depression-era creativity into something the world wanted to learn about. The television appearances, the speaking engagements, the letters from readers who'd found hope and practical guidance in stories I'd once been ashamed to tell. And most importantly, the daughter who'd finally learned to see her mother as a whole person rather than an obstacle to overcome. I thought about all the women who might be listening to this story. Women who'd been made to feel invisible by people who should have cherished them, who'd been told their contributions weren't sophisticated enough to matter, who'd learned to apologize for gifts that were actually precious. Here's what I learned. What I wish I could tell every one of you. Your worth doesn't depend on other people's ability to see it. The skills you've developed, the wisdom you've earned, the love you've given, all of that has value whether or not anyone acknowledges it. But more than that, it's never too late to become visible in new ways. To discover that the things you thought were ordinary about yourself are actually extraordinary. To build communities that appreciate exactly who you are instead of demanding you become someone else. The people who can't see your value aren't your people. Your people are out there, waiting for what only you can offer, ready to celebrate the very things that others took for granted. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who hurt you the most will eventually realize what they lost when they decided you weren't worth seeing. The silence that once made me feel invisible taught me to speak with my own voice. And that voice, it turns out, was exactly what the world needed to hear. Type 9 in the comments if you stayed with me through this entire story. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are already remarkable, exactly as you are.